is that Judge John Hlophe has lashed out against the head of the judiciary, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. Hlophe recently laid a complaint against Mogoeng Mogoeng, alleging that the country's top judge instigated a complaint against him. Now, Judge Hlophe, who heads the High Court in the Western Cape, says he has yet to hear whether the Judicial Service Commission will investigate Justice Mogoeng, but what he wants to see is action being taken. Now, this attack is the latest in a series of battles between the judges which have made their way into the public domain. Well, Diane Hawker and the Western Cape Premier, Helen Zille, former Western Cape Premier, I should say, Helen Zille, they joined me for this particular conversation. You'll remember that Helen Zille is also now the chairperson of the DA's Federal Council. Well, the two of them join me for a conversation now. Diane, let me quickly start with you. Take us back to the two complaints against Judge John Hlophe, because there are two in the main.
Yeah, I think what I have to do is actually take you back to 2008, where I think that the majority of these issues actually come from. So in 2008, the judges of the Constitutional Court, as a group, laid a complaint against Judge Hlophe. And part of the reason why Helen Zille has joined this conversation, because actually she had a role to play in that complaint ultimately being revived when she was Premier of the Western Cape. Okay. Now, our viewers might not recall, but we do have some graphics just to kind of take them through the timeline of what happened. But in 2008, initially there was a complaint by the Constitutional Court judges. And then subsequently, Judge Hlophe complained against the Constitutional Court judges as a group as well. From there was quite a lot of litigation, about 14 different cases that actually went to the High Court and ultimately the Supreme Court of Appeal. Yeah. The two complaints were actually heard. The first one against Judge Hlophe had to do with an allegation that he tried to influence two judges of the Constitutional Court. It related to a matter involving, at the time he was Deputy President Jacob Zuma, he later became President Jacob Zuma, and the allegation was that Judge Hlophe went to speak to these two judges to try and sway them in favor of the then Deputy President. Right. He then lays a complaint against the judges of the Constitutional Court saying, you shouldn't have publicly complained about me without giving me an opportunity to first respond or at least be aware of that complaint, and he accuses them of misconduct. There's quite a lot of back and forth on this, but ultimately there is a hearing on the matter. And the Judicial Service Commission, which is the body that makes decisions on what happens with judges when there are such complaints, there's a ruling from them that essentially says it seems like it was a conversation. Nobody disputes the conversation, but there isn't enough evidence here to say that this was actually something improper or to prove misconduct. And misconduct is quite a serious allegation when it comes to the judiciary. It's one of the three sort of points that can actually get you removed as a judge. But basically they say it's not a misconduct, an offense of misconduct. Fast forward a few years later and we find that that case has now been revived, and in December, in fact, the Judicial Service Commission is meant to rehear that. The reason for that is that the Western Cape Premier, former Premier, Helen Zille, along with Freedom Under Law, took the matter on review, saying that the way that matter was heard at the time was not correct. The Premier of each province is a member of the Judicial Service Commission because they help to decide on which judges are appointed in each province. Yeah. And the view from the Premier's perspective was that she should have been involved in that process. Yeah. I think Freedom Under Law took a different issue. And the Supreme Court of Appeal actually agreed that the cases need to be reheard. That was as far back as, I believe, 2012. It's now 2020, and we're only now hearing that first complaint is being heard. Then there's a second issue, which is the issue of the most recent complaints against Judge Hlophe. And that comes from the Deputy Judge President at the High Court in the Western Cape, saying that Judge Hlophe has made a very unhealthy working relationship. There's an accusation of assault. He's denied these allegations. He laid a counter-complaint against Judge Goliath, who is the Deputy Judge President. But in laying his counter-complaint, he has laid his own complaint against the Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. So as you can see, the matters are becoming much more complicated, many more complaints. There's actually another complaint against Judge Parker, who's one of the judges at the Western Cape High Court. That's laid by between 10 and 12 judges at that court. He is quite integral to the story because on the one hand, Judge Goliath is accusing Judge Hlophe of assaulting Judge Parker, but Judge Parker has said there isn't an assault. The judges at the court are saying, why does the story not match up when we were told by you, Judge Parker, that there was an assault? So quite a hectic situation, I would say, in terms of the judiciary when you see quite senior judges laying complaints and counter-complaints against one another. And I think something that we definitely have to keep a very close eye on as to how it unfolds, but actually that it does reach a point of completion.
Yeah. All right. Diane Hawker, you've laid the ground for us. Let me bring into the conversation Helen Zille. Ms. Zille, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. You've heard that background. At the time that you laid the complaint against Judge Hlophe, it related to the very first complaint that Diane Hawker spoke about, which was in 2008, and that had to do with whether or not Judge John Hlophe had sought to influence the two justices who sat in the Constitutional Court at the time. Let me just ask you firstly for an overall picture of these complaints that have come against Judge John Hlophe. What is your sense here about the time that it has taken to actually sort things out around Judge John Hlophe, and what, in your view, should actually happen to him?
Well, this is, of course, very, very damaging for our judiciary as a whole and the credibility of our judiciary. And in any constitutional democracy, the judiciary must be of the highest integrity and gain complete public respect because they defend everybody's rights as a last resort under the Constitution, and they treat everybody as equal before the law. Now, the complaint that the full Constitutional Court first raised against Judge John Hlophe was that he tried to influence two of their number, Judge Nkabinde and Judge Jafta, to make a positive finding in relation to then Deputy President Jacob Zuma. Now, this is quite an extraordinary thing for the full Constitutional Court to do, so they must have had a very good reason to do so. The Judicial Services Commission then met and decided that because people would have different accounts of the conversations that took place between Judge Nkabinde, Judge Jafta, and Judge Hlophe, that in fact they would not proceed with a disciplinary hearing against Judge Hlophe. Now, I was Premier at the time, and this seemed totally ridiculous to me, because in every case that is heard before any tribunal in law, people have different versions of what happened, and that is why they appear before a judicial tribunal. They appear there so that the court can weigh the different accounts and find out, either on a balance of probabilities or beyond reasonable doubt, what the truth is. So to say something quite absurd from the Judicial Service Commission as that people will have different accounts of what happened and therefore they couldn't place a disciplinary charge against John Hlophe was to me totally absurd. But there was a second point, and that is that they had excluded me from the discussion that reached that decision. Now, the Constitution says that the premiers of a province have to be involved in Judicial Service Commission matters affecting their province. And I said that given that Judge Hlophe is the Judge President of the Western Cape, that issue has to do with the Western Cape, and I'm the Premier of the Western Cape, well, I was then, obviously, not now, and I should have been at that meeting. The Judicial Service Commission disagreed, and I had to fight it right the way to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court found, indeed, that they had erred in excluding me. In the meantime, Freedom Under Law, under former Judge Krichler, challenged the Judicial Service Commission decision not to have a disciplinary inquiry into Judge Hlophe on the basis of the substantive case against him. And the Constitutional Court upheld that as well. So the original Judicial Service Commission decision not to investigate Judge Hlophe fell away. And since then, we have been waiting for the issue to come up. And now we received the news that it's going to come up on the 7th of December. Now, one of the reasons that it has taken so long is that the Judicial Service Commission in between changed the rules. And now the rules are very, very bureaucratic, which suits Judge Hlophe down to the ground, because he is a master at using every single technicality to put a brake on the process. Now, I've got to be very careful what I say about the Judge President, obviously, but this is borne out as a matter of fact. And this is a matter of grave, grave concern. So it would be very good if the issue actually does go ahead on the 7th of December. I'm not holding my breath, quite frankly, because anything can happen. This has been a delay of 12 years, as you say.
Yeah.
And, you know, he probably taught Jacob Zuma a thing or two about how to delay a court case, because we're only on Shabir Sheikh with Jacob Zuma. We haven't even got to the Guptas yet. So, you know, this is a challenging issue. Now, I've got to be very careful. I can't defame a judge. But then these are the facts before us. Yeah. They are just the facts before us. It's taken 12 years to get to the point of a first hearing on very serious allegations against a judge president with enormous powers who retires in a few years' time.
Helen Zille, I'm going to ask you to pause there for a moment, because we're going to bring this discussion back to that very first complaint that Helen Zille is talking about, that dates back to 2008. And I'm going to pick up with Diane Hawker, because the two judges that were said to have been influenced by Judge Hlophe, well, they broke their silence a long time ago, distancing themselves from such a complaint. So we're going to ask the question, should there be a continuation of this, given that this is now going to be heard? This is Newsfeed, the weekend edition. You watching Newsfeed, the weekend edition, and I'm still in conversation with our special projects editor, Diane Hawker, and of course we have the DA's federal chairperson, that's Helen Zille, sitting all the way in Cape Town. And we are in conversation about Judge John Hlophe. Diane Hawker, you spoke to the Judge President of the Western Cape, John Hlophe, and he had something to say about why he's speaking out now. Tell us what he said briefly, and then throw us to that particular point.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, you don't often get to hear from a judge. Oftentimes when they're speaking only about judicial matters and how to kind of keep the judiciary alive and giving speeches of that sort, or their own judgments, but not really speaking in their personal capacity. So this has been, I think, one of the rare instances where Judge Hlophe has spoken out. And I asked him just at the outset why that is, and if we could perhaps have that bite play, just so that our viewers can hear it. And I'll unpack that afterwards.
Well, I decided to speak out because I feel that I'm suffering in silence. There are a number of judges in this country that have complaints. There are complaints that have been made against a number of sitting judges in this country, including Judge's President. I'm aware of those complaints. And there are also complaints that have been made against the Chief Justice of this country, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. I have also filed complaints against him. and nobody is talking about those complaints. An impression is created that I'm the only judge in this country against whom there are complaints. So I've decided to speak out, let the truth be told.
Yeah.
I'm suffering in silence, and it is time for me to speak.
Yeah. So, look, Koli, I mean, I think that Judge Hlophe's name has, when we speak about complaints against judges, has really been at the forefront, partly because of the nature of the complaint. As Helen Zille did point out, it was quite unusual that the full Constitutional Court would complain against another very senior judge in the judiciary.
And you raise a very important point, because that's where I exactly want to come in. Viewers were made aware back then that it was two justices who were allegedly influenced by Judge John Hlophe on the Zuma matter. And those two justices were Justice Nkabinde and Chris Jafta. What did they say about this particular matter?
Well, the story gets quite interesting there, because both Justices Nkabinde and Jafta were very reluctant to actually put on the record that they were complainants in any way. In fact, they were saying that we had this conversation, so nobody denies that the conversations took place. But the issue is, was there influence, or was there an attempt at influence in the conversation? And they were saying that we had these conversations, we felt uncomfortable about them at the time, but not to the extent where we felt there was a need to lay complaints individually. And if you read the recent book that came out by the former Deputy Chief Justice Mogoeng, he actually unpacks in quite a lot of detail what happened, that there were some meetings that were held at the Constitutional Court, and the feeling was that when you are addressing the Constitutional Court, you address the court as a whole, and that was why the court should complain as a whole, as opposed to having the individuals who were spoken to complain. But then we saw after that statement came out and after the complaint was put forward that the two people who were really central to it backtracked. And that's one of the things that we also discuss in the interview with Judge Hlophe, that he felt that since they had backtracked, why was there a need to continue with this matter?
And perhaps that's where we are going to bring in Helen Zille back into the conversation. Ms. Zille, there it is, because in this conversation, Judge Hlophe raises the very important question about why is there still a continuation of this when the two people whom he allegedly influenced, they said no such thing happened.
Well, clearly, someone is lying. And that is why it's really very important to get to the bottom of this, and that is why a hearing is so necessary. Either Judge Jafta and Nkabinde misrepresented the situation to their colleagues on the Constitutional Court, who went public with this claim, with all the judges, including Judge Jafta and Nkabinde, together, or the rest of the Constitutional Court bench bullied Judge Jafta and Judge Nkabinde to do something they didn't want to do, or somebody in the Constitutional Court, apart from Judge Jafta and Nkabinde, is lying, or Judge Hlophe isn't telling the truth. Now that goes to the very heart of the credibility of the judiciary, and that's why it's all the more important, not less important, to find out who is not telling the truth. Judges, especially at Constitutional Court level, are supposed to be completely above reproach. They have got to be people of the most pure integrity. And when the full bench of the Constitutional Court comes out and says two of our number were sought to be influenced by the Judge President of the Western Cape to make a judgment favorable to Jacob Zuma, and then the two who allegedly claimed this withdraw, you've got to ask why they're withdrawing and get to the reasons. You've got to find out who was lying, because someone is. They can't all be right.
Diane,
Yeah.
the late Chief Justice Pius Langa, he then wrote a judgment on this matter, did he?
Oh, no, not a judgment, but he had the meetings with the judges, and
yes,
the actual affidavit that was ultimately submitted on behalf of the court was deposed to by the Chief Justice, who is now who's passed away, so he can't testify this time around. There's other witnesses or people who were involved at the time who have either left the court or have also passed away. So the list of witnesses has been whittled down essentially by time. One of the things I did ask Judge Hlophe is, now that this issue is meant to be heard once again, will he testify? And he said unequivocally that he will testify once again. He's also called on the former Deputy Chief Justice Mogoeng to take the stand, since he was there and wrote in his book about some of those discussions. So I think if it actually gets heard, and this is the thing, unfortunately after 12 years there's still a very big if about it, because what we have seen is that oftentimes there are delays that are based on litigation, where there's a legal issue that's raised about the process that's been followed or the composition of the commission or the tribunal, and then that ends up going through the courts. I would imagine that quite a large majority of the judges in South Africa have somehow been touched on by this complaint. If you look at 14 different court cases, they would have had to go through our courts. So you've got high court judges who've had to make a decision on this. You've got Supreme Court of Appeal judges who've had to make a decision on this. You've got constitutional court judges who are complainants, and others who've had to make a decision on this. So it's really engulfed the entire judiciary. But I would say that for the sake of the nation, there actually does need to be some finality to this, because at the end of the day, judges are public servants. We pay their salaries. And unlike politicians whose salaries stop being paid once they leave office, we continue to pay judges' salaries once they leave office. They are in service for life. There's a very important reason to that. It's to ensure that they are not susceptible to bribes and that kind of thing. It gives them security of tenure. But it also means that we have to be able to keep a close eye on what's happening in the judiciary, and whether there are people who are in that judiciary who need to actually be recused. One of the things that I did want to talk about is how a judge actually gets removed in South Africa.
Yeah.
It's a very specific process that is managed by the Judicial Service Commission, which Helen Zille mentioned earlier on. And if we could pull up those graphics perhaps for our viewers, the Judicial Service Commission in law actually manages the process of overseeing complaints. There are 3 ways in which a judge can be impeached, which is essentially if they have incapacity, gross incompetence, and gross misconduct. Yeah. And the complaints that Judge Hlophe is facing are gross misconduct complaints. But interestingly, recently, he has laid a gross misconduct complaint against the Chief Justice, which, as you and I discussed earlier on, makes the whole situation even more murky.
Helen Zille, on that very last point that Diane has just made, what do you think the intentions of the Western Cape Judge President are of laying a complaint of gross misconduct against the Chief Justice of this country, Mogoeng Mogoeng? What do you think his intentions are here?
Well, following in from the news reports, I saw a report some while back in which Judge Mogoeng said, or was reported to have said, that Judge Hlophe did indeed have a case to answer in connection with an alleged assault on Judge Parker. And then Judge Mogoeng had several other things to say about that. And I think Judge Hlophe considers that as defamatory.
So perhaps I can also just give the viewers a better understanding of what's going on with that matter.
Because this is now the second complaint.
That's
We're
correct.
moving on from the 2008 complaint.
Yes.
This is now the complaint that surfaced recently.
Very recently, from the beginning of this year, I believe, if not 2019.
Yeah.
So the Deputy Judge President in the Western Cape High Court, also a very senior judge, has acted at the Constitutional Court, has applied also previously to be a judge on the Constitutional Court. So these are not, spats amongst junior judges. She's laid a complaint against Judge Hlophe, alleging a number of things. But included in her allegation is that he has assaulted another judge, Judge Parker. She's accused him of also making an untenable working relationship at the court. She's also accused him of verbal abuse, and basically said that amounts to misconduct and that he should be investigated. He laid a complaint against her after her complaint, saying she shouldn't have laid this complaint in this manner, and the way in which her complaint is structured amounts to misconduct. The Judicial Service Commission looked at this, and ultimately Judge Mogoeng decided that there should be a hearing of this and that there was some sort of case to answer. Incidentally, other judges in the court have complained against Judge Parker, and the Judicial Service Commission is also expected to adjudicate on that. So, as you can see, it doesn't seem like things are looking very good at the High Court in the Western Cape. But in responding to the allegations against him, Judge Hlophe says that Justice Mogoeng has been involved in the complaint brought by Judge Goliath from the beginning, so that he's basically not an impartial party making a decision, that he knew about it prior, and that, not his words, not mine, that the Chief Justice instigated the complaint. And that's part of what we discuss in the interview, which will air later on this evening.